canal is a ditch. You cut a channel down to the level of the sea and the water runs through it, and the ships follow the water. That is what a canal is. That is what a canal has always been. This one does the opposite. Here, a ship the length of 3 football fields, loaded with 60,000 tons of steel and cargo, does not sail through Panama. It climbs. Up, over a mountain, and down the far side. Only then does it reach the other ocean. It rises the height of an 8-story building. It crosses a ridge that runs the spine of 2 continents. And the water that carries it up there is not pushed by any engine, any pump, any machine at all. Both of these things are true at the same time. A canal is meant to bring the ocean inland. This one lifts the ocean uphill and lets it fall away again on the far side. So how does a ship climb a mountain to cross the sea? The answer is not in the ships, it is in the water, and in where that water comes from. Start at the Atlantic mouth. A ship arrives from the open sea and stops. Ahead of it is a wall of steel, a pair of gates, each leaf taller than a 7-story building, meeting in the middle like the doors of a cathedral. Behind those gates is a chamber, a box of concrete, 1,000 feet long, 110 feet wide. The ship noses inside. The gates swing shut behind it. And now it is sealed in a room, floating on a pool of still water with a wall in front and a wall behind. Then something begins to happen that you can feel before you can see it. Water starts to enter, not over the walls, not through a hose. It comes up through the floor. Beneath every chamber run great tunnels, culverts 18 feet across, wide enough to drive a truck through. They branch into smaller channels, and those open through 100 holes in the floor of the box. When the valves upstream are opened, water floods up through all 100 holes at once. The surface boils, the ship rises, and in about 8 minutes, the vessel and everything on it has lifted more than 20 feet, quietly, evenly, on nothing but the weight of water finding its own level. There are no pumps. There is nothing forcing the water up. The water comes from a lake that sits higher than the chamber. Open the valve and it simply falls in, downhill, the only direction water ever moves. It fills the box until the level inside matches the level of the next box up the staircase. Then the far gates open, the ship moves forward, and the whole thing repeats. 3 times at this end. 3 chambers, 3 lifts, one after another. Each one raises the ship a little higher. By the top of the 3rd, the vessel is riding 85 feet above the sea it came from, floating on the surface of an inland lake, on a hilltop, in the middle of the continent. That is the climb, not a metaphor. A ship lifted 100 feet into the air by water that no one pumped, and set down on a lake that should not be there. And every foot of that lift comes at a price. To raise one ship through this staircase, the locks spill something close to 50 million gallons of fresh water. It pours in, it lifts the ship, and then, as the ship goes down the far side, that same water drains away, down and out into the sea. 50 million gallons, gone with a single crossing. Remember that number. We will come back to what it really costs. Look closer at how one of these chambers actually works, because the whole machine is built into its walls. Those walls are not solid. They are hollow, threaded with the culverts that carry the water, and with galleries where the machinery lives. A drainage tunnel runs along the bottom. Above it, a gallery for the electrical wiring. Above that, a passage where the operators walk to reach the gears. The wall between two side-by-side chambers is 60 feet thick enough to hold a control room, a power line, and a walkway all at once, and still stop a 1,000-foot ship dead. And the gates that hold all this back are the heart of it. Each one is two great leaves, hinged at the walls, that swing out to meet in the middle and lean against each other under the pressure of the water. The higher the water climbs behind them, the harder they press together, and the tighter they seal. The water does not fight the gates, it locks them shut. And these are not small doors. Each leaf is a slab of steel as tall as a building, and heavy beyond easy imagining. Yet it swings on its hinge, slowly, smoothly, driven by a motor buried in the wall. It takes a couple of minutes to open or close a gate, a deliberate, unhurried movement, because there is no rushing a wall of that mass without tearing it from its mountings. Watch the two leaves ease apart, and it looks almost gentle. But between them and the lake stands the whole weight of the water and the whole safety of the crossing, and they hold it without strain, day after day, for longer than most machines are allowed to live. The men who built this understood exactly how much was resting on those gates. If a gate ever failed, if a runaway ship struck it and it gave way, the lake above would come pouring down through the locks in a wall of water, all the way to the sea. So they doubled them. At the top of every flight, there is not one gate, but two, set apart, so that a single failure cannot drain the mountain. Two gates would have to fail at once. The whole safety of the crossing is built on the refusal to trust a single point. And it is all run from one room. Every gate, every valve, is worked by electric machinery, and all of it reports back to a control room built into the centre wall. In the old locks, the operator worked in front of a moving model of the whole flight, small brass gates and valves that mirrored, in real time, exactly what the real ones were doing far below. And the controls were wired against human error. You could not open the valve that fills a chamber while the valve that drains it was still open. The machine would refuse. One wrong move at a time was designed to be impossible. And nothing here stands alone, not even the locks. At each of the three lock sites, the chambers are built in pairs, two full flights side by side, sharing a centre wall. Most of the time they run as two lanes of traffic, letting ships move in both directions at once. But the pairing is also insurance. If one lane has to be drained for repair, the gates inspected, the concrete patched, the machinery serviced, the other lane keeps the crossing open. The canal was built to be maintained without ever fully closing. A machine that can never stop had to be able to heal one half of itself while the other half keeps working. And it takes a small city of people to run: pilots and their apprentices, line handlers on the water, operators in the control rooms, tug crews, dredge crews, electricians, gate mechanics, the schedulers redrawing the day's plan, the measurers who size each ship, the launch drivers who ferry pilots out before dawn. Thousands of them, in shifts around the clock, so that the gates never stop opening and the ships never stop climbing. For all the automation, the canal is still, at heart, a very large number of people keeping a very old machine turning. But first, why lift the ship at all? Why not just cut a channel straight through, ocean to ocean, and let the ships sail on the flat, the way they do at Suez? Because of what stands in the way. Down the whole length of Panama runs a spine of hills, the tail end of a mountain range that begins thousands of miles north. It is the Continental Divide, the ridge that splits the waters of a hemisphere. Rain that falls on one side runs to the Atlantic. Rain on the other side runs to the Pacific. And that ridge does not stop for a canal. Here at least, it dips lower than almost anywhere along its length. This is the narrowest neck of the Americas, the thinnest place between the two great oceans. It is why the canal is here and nowhere else. But even at its lowest, the ridge still rises high above the sea. The first builders tried to dig it away. They wanted a flat, sea-level channel, the ocean at both ends and nothing in between. So they cut. Through the divide itself, through a gap in the hills, they carved a trench, the deepest wound in the whole project. And the hills fought back. The walls of the cut slid. Rock and mud poured into the trench faster than it could be hauled out. Whole hillsides let go and buried a day's work in a single afternoon. The chief engineer of the American effort, John Frank Stevens, sees the problem for what it is. A sea-level canal here means a war against the mountain that the mountain will win. So he changes the question entirely. If you cannot bring the ship down to a level channel through the divide, then lift the ship up and float it over the top. Dam the river, flood the valley, build a staircase of water, and let the ships climb. That is the decision the whole canal rests on. Not a bigger shovel, a staircase of water. The ridge that refused to be dug away is the reason the ships have to climb at all. Hold on to that. It comes back at the very end of the journey. So the cut remains, not a sea-level ditch, but a narrow gorge sliced through the divide. Its water held high above the oceans. It is the tightest part of the crossing. In places, the channel is so narrow that the largest ships cannot pass each other. For a stretch, traffic can only move one way at a time, a single file corridor through the heart of the mountain, the whole two-ocean trade squeezed through a slot in the rock. And a ship this size cannot be trusted to steer itself through a slot like that. Watch a vessel enter the locks and you will see something strange. The ship moves forward under its own engines. That part is the ship's own power. But it does not drive itself. On the walls of the lock, running on rails, are small electric locomotives. The men who built this place called them mules, after the animals that once hauled boats along canals by rope. They do not pull the ship forward, they hold it. Cables run from the mules to the ship, 2 at the bow, 2 at the stern, sometimes 8 in all. And their job is to keep it centered, to stop it from touching the walls. Because the walls are close. A great ship inside these old chambers has as little as 2 feet of water on either side. 2 feet, the length of your arm. On a vessel that weighs more than the town it is passing. The mules take up the slack on one side, pay out on the other, and thread that steel through the eye of a needle, foot by foot, while the ship's own engines barely turn over. And they climb as they go. Between one chamber and the next, the track pitches up a slope as steep as a hillside path, and the mules haul themselves up it on a toothed rail, gripping the rack like a cog so they can keep pace with a ship that is rising beneath them. They are not really vehicles. They are climbing machines, walking a ship up a mountain on a leash. Its power drives it, but it surrenders its balance. The thing that carries oceans across is walked through the locks like a horse on a lead. And it takes hands to do it. Before a mule can hold a ship, someone has to connect them. Small boats run out to the vessel as it approaches the wall, carrying line handlers who pass the mule's cables up to the ship's crew, who make them fast to the bollards on deck. It is close, physical work, done in the narrow water beside a moving hull the height of a building. Throwing lines, catching lines, easing a giant into a box with feet to spare. For all the electric machinery and the century of engineering, the ship still enters the locks the way boats have always entered locks, because a person on the water handed a rope to a person on the ship. Now lift your eyes off the ship and look at the water it is floating on. This is the strangest part of the whole machine. The ship, at the top of the climb, is not on a canal at all. It is on a lake. A wide, quiet, freshwater lake, ringed by green hills and drowned forest, more than 20 miles across. For most of the crossing, the ship does not travel through a channel. It sails over the surface of a lake that sits on top of the mountains. So, where did a lake come from at the summit of the continent? It was made. A river ran through here once, the Chagres, a wild river, one of the few that crosses the divide. In the wet months, it could rise many feet in a single night and tear out everything in its path. It was, at first, the great enemy of the whole project, the thing that flooded the works and drowned the trenches. And then the builders did something to it that turned the enemy into the engine. They threw a dam across it. At the time, it was the largest dam on Earth. The river backed up behind it, spread out through the valleys and hollows of the interior, and rose, and kept rising, until it had filled the whole basin. River became a lake. And that lake became the thing every ship floats on to cross Panama. The day the dam closes, the water has nowhere to go but up. It climbs the hillsides. It swallows the low ground. It rises over farmland, over villages, over the roofs of houses and the line of an old railway, until the tops of the highest hills are left as scattered islands in a new inland sea. The lake you cross today is a valley that was deliberately drowned. No one talks much about what was under it, but it was there. Homes, fields, a way of life, a river that had run to the sea for longer than there were people to watch it. All of it now lies beneath the keels of the ships. The water that lifts the world's trade over the mountains is standing on top of a place that used to be dry land. And that lake was only half the cost. The men who dug this crossing worked in heat and mud and disease, and the ground took a great many of them before a single ship ever passed. The machine that runs so smoothly today was built on a drowned valley, and on lives it did not give back. It is worth saying plainly, and then letting it rest. Because that drowned valley is not just scenery, it is the fuel. Every gallon that fills a lock chamber comes from this lake. When a ship rises at the Atlantic end, the water that lifts it falls out of this lake. When a ship sinks at the Pacific end, the water that lowers it falls out of this lake. The lake is the reservoir at the top of the staircase, the tank that feeds every lift, at both ends, all day, every day. Without the lake, there is no water to move the ships, and without water to move the ships, the whole crossing stops. So what keeps the lake full? Rain, nothing else. Nobody pipes water up here. There is no pump filling the reservoir. The lake is refilled only by what falls out of the sky over the hills around it, gathered by the rivers and run down into the basin. And that is where the forest comes in. Around the lake stands rainforest, dense, wet, breathing forest that climbs the hills of the interior. It is not decoration, it is part of the engine. The trees pull water up out of the ground and breathe it back into the air. The forest holds the soil so the rains don't wash the hillsides into the lake and choke it with mud. It shades the ground so less of the water burns off in the heat. In this climate, the forest and the rain make each other. Cut the forest, and you don't just lose the trees, you loosen the whole system that keeps the sky handing water back to the lake. So the chain is longer than it looks. The ship floats because the lake is full. The lake is full because it rains. It rains, in part, because the forest is there. And the forest is there because, for now, it has been left to stand. On the drowned hilltops that became islands, the forest that survived the flooding still holds. Howler monkeys call across the water at dawn. Birds work the canopy above channels where cargo ships pass a few hundred yards away. Those islands are living gauges. As long as they are green, the machine has its rain. When forests like them start to thin, the whole system upstream of the ships begins, very quietly, to change. There is even a second lake behind the first, a smaller reservoir, higher still, held back by its own dam. When the main lake runs low, this one can be opened to top it up. A spare tank, in reserve, for the dry months. Even the backup runs on rain. And the same water does one more job before it ever touches a ship. The machinery of the locks, the gates, the valves, the mules on the walls, all of it runs on electricity. And much of that power, historically, came from the very same water system. The river, the dam, the fall of water turning generators. Think about what that means. The water opens the gates. The gates let in the water. The water lifts the ship. The lake fills the locks and, at the same time, helps make the power that works the locks. It is a machine that runs, at almost every level, on one falling supply of rain. And because it is an electric machine, it lives and dies by that current. Picture a ship half lifted in a chamber, the water rising, the gates sealed, and the power fails. The valves freeze where they are. The gates will not move. The mules stop dead on the walls, a 1,000-foot ship hanging on. They're cables between two chambers. Nothing catastrophic happens in that instant. The water is not going anywhere. The gates are holding. But the crossing simply halts, and every ship behind it halts too, until the current comes back and the machine can breathe again. A canal that moves 5% of the world's trade can be brought to a standstill not by a storm or a war, but by the same thing that darkens a house, the power going out. Now put a single ship back into that picture. It arrives at the mouth of the canal. What happens next is not automatic. The captain does not take his own ship through. He can't. The moment a vessel enters these waters, a pilot climbs aboard. A Panama Canal pilot, someone who has spent years learning this one narrow crossing, every reach of it, every turn, every shifting shallow. And from that moment, the pilot has command. Not advice, command. Foreign flag, home flag, cargo ship, warship, it does not matter. On this water, the ship belongs to the pilot until the far ocean. Follow one of them for a crossing. In the dark before dawn, A launch carries the pilot out to a ship riding at anchor, and the pilot climbs a rope ladder up the side of a hull the height of a building. On the bridge, the captain steps back. For the next 8 to 10 hours, this pilot will speak the orders into the locks, across the lake, through the single-file cut where the walls close in, and down the far staircase to the other sea. Every rudder movement, every touch of the engines passes through one person who holds the whole crossing in their head. There is no autopilot for a slot with 2 feet to spare. There is a human being and their memory of the water. And that lake is not the open water it looks like. Sail out across it, and it seems endless, an inland sea scattered with green islands. But a ship cannot go where it likes. It follows a channel, a road dredged along the drowned bed of the old river, winding between the tops of hills that are now islands, marked out by buoys and by ranges lined up on the far shore. Stray a few hundred yards off that line, and the ship runs aground on a hilltop that was farmland a century ago. So the pilot threads the giant along an invisible road, laid down the middle of a lake, over the ghost of a river that no longer flows. The whole crossing of the summit is a careful walk down a submerged valley the ship cannot see. And it is a relay. The lake is divided into named reaches, long straight runs and sharp bends, each one handed from marker to marker like a baton. Ships are spaced out along it, a set gap between each hull, so that the traffic flows without ever meeting head-on where the channel is too tight to pass. From above, it looks like a slow, deliberate procession. Vessels strung along a line through the trees, each one holding its place in a queue that stretches from one ocean to the other. Above the locks sits a control room. Inside it, operators run the gates and the valves, deciding which chamber fills, which empties, which gate opens next, in what order, for which ship. Out on the water, a traffic system watches every hull at once, tracking each vessel's position along the whole length of the crossing, the way an air traffic controller watches planes stacked over a runway. And here is the thing they are really managing. There is only so much water. There is only so much daylight. There is only so much room in that single-file cut through the mountain. Ships arrive at both oceans at once, wanting to cross in both directions, and only a certain number can be threaded through in a day. Some vessels are too big to pass another in the narrows and can only move by day. Some must tie up in the lake overnight and wait for morning to finish the crossing. So there is a schedule, a master plan for the day's crossings, deciding who goes when, in which direction, through which set of locks, with what gap between them. And that schedule is not fixed. It is redrawn constantly, through the morning, through the afternoon, over and over. A ship runs late at one end, and the whole order downstream has to shift. Why a plan this careful has to be torn up and rewritten so many times a day, that becomes the whole story soon. Keep it in mind. And there has always been a second way across this neck of land, running right beside the water. A railway crosses the isthmus shore to shore, older than the canal itself, laid down when the only way over was on foot or by mule through the jungle. It still runs. It carries the traffic the water cannot. Containers lifted off a ship at one ocean run across the land by train and stacked onto a different ship at the other. When the canal is crowded or a vessel is too large, the boxes can leap the isthmus by rail while the ship waits or sails on empty. 2 crossings of the same 40 miles, one by water over the mountain, one by iron around it, feeding each other, covering for each other. Between them run the roads, and the roads have their own problem. A bridge over a canal cannot rest a pier in the shipping lane, and it cannot hang so low that a ship's masts would strike it. So the highways that cross here leap the water in single great spans, one near each ocean, arched high enough to let the tallest vessels pass beneath. Even the traffic on the land has to bow to the traffic on the water. For 100 years, the ships that fit these chambers defined a size the whole shipping world was built around. If a vessel was too long or too wide to enter a 1,000-foot box 110 feet across, it simply could not cross here. Shipping lines built their fleets to that limit, to the exact dimensions of these locks. A canal quietly shaping the shape of the world's ships, until the ships outgrew it. Vessels were built bigger than the old chambers could hold, and they began to sail the long way around, past the bottom of a continent rather than shrink to fit. So a second, wider staircase was added, a whole new set of locks, built alongside the old ones, big enough to swallow ships half again as large. But a bigger lock is a thirstier lock. A larger chamber holds more water. More water per lift means more of the lake spilled to the sea with every crossing, and the lake is only ever refilled by rain. Build a lock that can pass a bigger ship, and you have also built a lock that drinks more of the one thing you cannot make more of. So the new locks were built to claw some of it back. Beside each chamber sit basins, great side tanks, stepped like terraces. When it is time to empty the chamber, the water doesn't all rush out to sea. Much of it is let sideways into these basins first, held there, and then poured back into the chamber for the next ship. It is the same water, used again. By the time it finally reaches the ocean, it has done its work several times over. Roughly 3/5 of every lift is saved this way. A machine designed from the start around the fear of running out of water. Even the mules are gone from the new locks. The ships there are too big for the old locomotives on the walls. Instead, tugboats take the giants in hand, one ahead, one behind, and nudge them through the wider chambers. But the principle underneath has not changed at all. Gates, chambers, water falling downhill by gravity, a ship climbing. So there are now, in effect, two canals sharing one mountain. The old locks, a century old, still lifting the ships that fit them, mules on the walls, 3 steps up one side and 3 down the other. And beside them the new locks, wider and deeper, hoarding their water in side basins, tugboats in place of mules. 2 staircases, built 100 years apart, drawing from the very same lake, feeding into the very same cut, run by the very same control. A ship arriving at the ocean is sorted between them by size, small enough for the old flight or large enough to need the new one. 2 machines, 1 water. And when the lake runs low, they compete for it, gallon for gallon, like 2 taps drawing on a single tank. And to earn a place in that day's schedule, to get one of those crossings, a ship has to pay. The toll here is not a flat fee. Before a vessel crosses, it is measured precisely. Every ship formally sized so the charge can be set by what it can carry. That measuring is its own ritual. Surveyors board the ship and work out its exact capacity. Not its weight, but the volume it can hold, calculated by a formula the canal has used for generations. A number is fixed to the hull, and it follows that ship for the rest of its life, unless the ship is rebuilt. Everything downstream flows from that number. the toll it pays, the lane it fits, the priority it earns. Before a ship is ever a place in the schedule, it is a figure in a ledger, sized, recorded, and priced. A container ship is billed by the number of boxes it can stack. A great loaded ship can pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for a single crossing, an afternoon's transit costing more than a house. And the ships pay it, willingly, because the alternative is sailing thousands of extra miles around the far end of a continent, burning fuel the whole way. The crossing is expensive. The detour is far more expensive still. And think about what is riding on those decks. Grain grown in the middle of one continent, bound for the far side of another. Fuel in the bellies of tankers. Cars, machinery, refrigerated boxes of fruit, and container after container of the ordinary things that fill the world's shelves. Much of it stacked so high, the ship looks like a floating city block. A large share of everything that moves between the oceans passes through this one narrow gap. When the crossing slows, shelves on the far side of the planet feel it weeks later. The lake at the top of the mountain is not just lifting ships, it is metering the flow of goods between whole hemispheres, a few dozen hulls at a time. And the flow is not steady through the year. It swells when a harvest comes in and the grain ships queue at one ocean. It swells again ahead of the seasons when the world buys most and the container ships stack up waiting for a slot. The canal breathes with the calendar of a planet's trade. Busy, then quiet, then busy again, and the schedule has to swell and shrink to meet it. But money buys more than passage. It buys time. Because on the busiest days, more ships want to cross than can cross, and a queue forms at both oceans. Vessels riding at anchor, waiting their turn, sometimes for days. And a ship at anchor is a ship earning nothing. So the canal auctions its scarcest hours. A handful of crossing slots each day are sold to the highest bidder. And when the queue is long enough, the bidding turns fierce. Ships have paid extraordinary sums, far beyond the normal toll, simply to jump the line, to buy their way to the front of a queue of 90 waiting vessels and save themselves a week at anchor. Think about what is really being sold there. Not water, not distance, time. On the days when the canal cannot pass everyone, the thing it is actually rationing is the hour of the crossing itself. A public waterway open to the shipping of the world, quietly selling its busiest moments to whoever needs them most. And out at both mouths, the ships wait for their moment. At the Atlantic end, near the old port city, and at the Pacific end, beneath the long bridge that carries the highway over the canal's mouth, anchorages full of vessels, holding, drifting, watching for their slot. These are not empty waiting rooms. They are working ports in their own right. Cranes lifting boxes on and off, cargo changing ships, fuel and food and crews moving in the shadow of the giants. Long before any vessel enters the canal, the paperwork has already gone ahead. Every ship announced days in advance, measured, inspected, scheduled, slotted into the day's plan. The crossing that looks, from the deck, like an afternoon's sail was arranged long before the mountain came into view. And even at rest, the ships are inside the system, counted, ordered, and waiting on a number that decides when their turn will come. Then, at last, the ship is called forward
and it begins the second half of the climb, the way down. Because a staircase up the mountain is only half a canal. Having lifted the ship 85 feet to the lake, the machine now has to set it back down on the far ocean. So at the Pacific end, the whole process runs in reverse. The ship reaches the edge of the highland, enters a chamber, and this time the water drains out beneath it instead of flooding in. The surface drops. The ship sinks. Gate by gate, chamber by chamber, it steps back down toward the sea. First, one lock on its own, dropping the ship to a small pool held at a middle height. A little artificial lake, itself perched above the ocean, a landing halfway down the stairs. Then, a short run across that pool and a final flight of 2 more locks lowers the ship the rest of the way to
the Pacific. The descent is not one clean drop. It is broken into steps with a rest between them, the same way the climb was, a staircase run in reverse, with a landing in the middle. And here the crossing hides one last oddity. You would think the 2 oceans sit at the same height. Sea level is sea level, surely. They do not, quite. The tides on the Pacific side are large, swinging up and down by many feet with the pull of the moon. The tides on the Atlantic side barely move at all. So the exact drop the ship must make at the Pacific end is never quite the same twice. At low tide, the last lock has further to lower the ship. At high tide, less. The machine has to account for the moon, which is the answer to a question left hanging at the start. Why lift the ship at all? Why the staircase, the lake, the mountain of water? Because the ridge could not be dug down to the sea, and the 2 oceans do not even agree on where the sea is. The divide won. The engineers stopped trying to bring the water down to a level line and instead built a machine that carries the ship up and over the disagreement, and lets the moon and the mountain be what they are. And it has done this for more than a century. The first vessel to make the full crossing did so generations ago, and the same trick has worked every single day since. The same gravity, the same falling water, the same climb and descent, repeated for hundreds of thousands of ships across 100 years. Fleets have come and gone. The world that trades through it has been remade many times over, but the mechanism at the center of it has barely changed. Open a valve, let the lake fall in, lift the ship. A machine old enough to have watched the shape of global trade turn over, still running on the oldest force there is. Away from the ships, the machine never truly sleeps. Where the lake narrows into the cut, a fleet of dredgers works the channel, day and night, endlessly, because the hills are still shedding into the water, still trying to fill the gorge the way they filled the Builder's Trench a century ago. This is its own quiet department of the machine. Boats that do nothing but dig, crews that do nothing but hold the channel open. The slides never fully stopped. Long after the canal opened, whole hillsides above the cut let go and slumped toward the water, and the channel had to be scooped clear again, and the banks cut back to gentler slopes. Even now the work continues, deepening here, widening there, hauling out what the mountain sends down. Scoop by scoop, they hold the line against a ridge that has never accepted the wound. And the crossings themselves do not stop at dusk. Under floodlights, ships climb the locks through the night, the gates opening and closing in the dark, the mules threading the giants through while most of the world sleeps. The crossing you take for granted is a truce, renewed every single hour between the water and the rock. So, a mountain climbed by water, a lake made from a drowned river, a forest that helps summon the rain. power drawn from the same falling water that lifts the ships, pilots who take command of every hull, a railway and 2 high bridges shadowing the crossing, a schedule torn up and rewritten hourly, locks built in dread of running dry, and a whole system rationing not water, not distance, but time. Every one of those parts leans on the others. And the question that started us, why the schedule is redrawn so many times a day, has an answer now. It is not the ships, it is the water. Pull out any single piece and watch the whole thing stop. Jam one gate and a chamber cannot seal, and the flight above it backs up, and the ships queue at both oceans. Let one hillside slide into the narrows, and the single file cut closes, and nothing crosses until the dredgers have hauled the mountain back out. Cut the power, and the gates freeze mid-lift. Cut the forest, and the rain thins, and the lake falls, and the locks run short of the water they spend. Drain the lake, and there is nothing to lift a ship at all. There is no spare part that makes the rest optional. Every piece is load-bearing. The canal is not a chain of separate systems that happen to sit side by side. It is one system, wearing the shape of many. Because for all its steel and concrete, this machine runs on rain. And the rain does not always come. There is a season here for it, months when the sky opens over the hills and the rivers run brown and full, and the lake climbs back to the top of its banks. That is when the reservoir is meant to refill, storing up the water it will spend, lock by lock, across the dry months to follow. The whole machine is built on the assumption that the wet season will deliver. So the lake is run like a bank account. Through the wet months, the reservoir fills. The rains bank a year's worth of water behind the dam. Then, through the dry months, the locks draw it down, gallon by gallon, spending the savings on every ship that climbs. The reserve lake behind it can be tapped when the balance runs thin, a second account opened to cover the first. In a normal year, the books balance. The wet season deposits roughly what the dry season withdraws, and the level swings up and down within safe banks. The entire operation is a slow, careful budgeting of rainfall, spending in the dry, saving in the wet, and trusting that the seasons will keep the account from ever reaching zero. But some years, it underdelivers. The rains come late, or thin, or not enough. And when that happens, the lake at the top of the staircase does not refill. It drops. Slowly, foot by foot, the surface of the reservoir sinks. And a lower lake changes everything downstream. Watch what breaks. Less water in the reservoir means less water to spend on lifts. So the number of ships allowed to cross each day is cut. The queue at the oceans grows longer, and there is a second squeeze. A ship rides deep in the water when it is heavily loaded, and it needs a certain depth beneath its keel to pass. When the lake is low, that depth shrinks. So ships are told to carry less, to leave cargo behind on the dock, so they float higher and don't scrape the bottom of the shallow crossing. So the operators fight the shortage with the only weapon they have, the water itself. They pass 2 ships through one chamber together, sharing a single fill. They move water sideways between the paired lanes instead of letting it run to sea, so one chamber's spill helps fill another. Every trick is a way of spending the same gallon twice. In a dry year, the crossing stops being a matter of ships at all. It becomes a careful accounting of water. How much is left? How far it will stretch? How many hulls it can lift before the lake falls too low? That is why the schedule is redrawn all day. It is bending, constantly, to the level of the water. And the level of the water is bending to the sky. When the rains are thin, the planners are not really managing ships at all. They are managing a shrinking pool of rainwater and rationing it, hour by hour, among everyone who wants to cross. Now stand at the top of the whole machine and look down the chain one last time. A ship crosses. To lift it up and set it down again, the locks spend close to 50 million gallons of fresh water, and almost all of it runs out in the end to the sea. That is the number from the very beginning. Now you can feel its full weight. Every single crossing pours a small lake into the ocean, and nothing brings it back. Only the sky brings it back. That is the thing no pump could ever do. At the start, we said no engine lifts the water in these locks, that it moves by gravity alone. And that is true inside the chamber. But it hides the real machine, because something does have to lift all that water back up to the top of the mountain over and over to be spent again. And the only thing that lifts it is the weather. Rain falls on the hills, the rivers carry it down, the lake fills, and the water is back at the summit, ready to fall through the locks once more. The pump at the heart of the Panama Canal is the sky, and that same water does something else. The lake at the top of the mountain is not only the fuel for the ships, it is also the drinking water for the country around it, the reservoir that fills the taps of the cities, the water in the glass on the kitchen table for more than half the people of the nation. So the lake is shared. Every 50 million gallons spent to lift a ship over the mountain is 50 million gallons not sitting in the reservoir behind the taps. Ships and throats drink from the same lake. In a good year, there is enough for both, easily,
and no one has to choose. In a dry year, the same falling reservoir that slows the ships is the reservoir a city drinks from. The world's trade and a nation's thirst, waiting together on the same rain. And there is no way to separate them. The water that lifts a ship and the water that fills a glass are drawn from the same reservoir, held behind the same dam, refilled by the same clouds. You cannot give the ships more without leaving the taps less, and you cannot fill the taps without spending water the ships need. Every year the balance has to be struck again. How much for the crossings? How much for the cities? How much held back in case the next rains fail? In the wettest years, it is not a hard sum. In the driest, it is the only sum that matters, and it is done with the whole reservoir sinking a little lower each day. We call this an engineering marvel. And it is. The gates, the culverts, the century-old concrete, the mules, the pilots, the basins that hoard the water. But strip all of it away and look at what is underneath, and it is not really a monument to engineering at all. It is a weather machine, a vast, patient device for turning rainfall into the movement of ships. Everything else, the steel, the schedule, the tolls, the auctions, is just the apparatus around that single fact. A canal is a ditch, we said at the start. This one is not a ditch. It is not even, really, a staircase. It is a single machine, and every part of it holds up every other part. The ship rises because the lake is high. The lake is high because it rained. It rained because the forest stood. The forest stands because it was spared. The gates that let the water in are worked by power the water itself helps make. And the whole global shortcut, a large share of everything the world ships, threaded through one narrow neck of land, hangs at the very top of that chain on whether the clouds arrive over a stretch of hills in Central America. Remove one part, and the whole thing stops. The world's ships climb a mountain to cross Panama, and the thing that carries them over the top is not the steel, and not the engines, and not the men in the control room. It is the rain, and the forest that helps make it,
and a drowned valley holding it all in place. The mightiest shortcut in global trade, running, quietly, completely, on the weather. The machine keeps turning. The gates open and close. The mules thread the giants through, foot by foot. The lake gives up its water, and the sky, most years, gives it back. It is one of the most reliable things human beings have ever built, and it rests, from top to bottom, on a sky no one can command. No one can promise the rains will always come as they have. No one can say how full the lake will be a generation from now, or how many ships will be waiting at the oceans when the dry seasons come, or whether the forest that helps summon the water will still be standing to do it. The machine will keep running as long as the water keeps rising to the top of the mountain. And whether it does, is the one thing this vast, precise, magnificent system was never built to control. If you've stayed with us to the top of the mountain and back down the other side, thank you. There are more of these journeys ahead, more places that only make sense once you can see the machine underneath them. Subscribe and travel with us to the next one. Until then.